Ooh, a spicy question. I
because
love
the writing is sort of everything, right? Like you kind of can fix plot holes, but if the writing is
so some readers love that, and some readers are like, "But I wanted more of this." So it's kind of a gamble.
Hello and welcome back to the Right and Wrong podcast. On today's episode, I am joined by literary agent Zoe Ross. Hello, welcome.
Hi there. Hi, thank you very much for having me.
Thanks so much for coming on. Jumping right in, you are part of the United Agents team and have been since, is it 2009?
Yes, frighteningly.
15 years.
15 years this September, yeah.
Yeah. Am I right in thinking you didn't start as an agent or an agent's assistant, you actually started in the foreign rights department?
That is true, yes. I started as a foreign rights assistant and kind of jumped around quite a lot over a number of years between foreign rights. Then I did move across to be an agent's assistant. I also sold audio rights exclusively at one point, and then I spent a few years doing book-to-screen rights.
Okay.
During which time I was beginning gradually to build my own client list before I sort of became a full-time primary agent.
Okay, so to some degree, being a literary agent sounds like it was always the direction you were headed.
Yeah, exactly. And then it always just takes a little longer than you might anticipate when you're in your early mid-20s to get where you'd like to be.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, I think I quickly realised that I'd like to represent my own clients, and then it was just a question of finding a path to that. But I'm really grateful for all of that varied experience I had, because I think it set me up really nicely, because I continue to, for example, represent my own clients for book to screen, which I wouldn't have been able to do had I not had those few years of experience across the whole United Agents list. So in retrospect, I think it all sort of makes sense as a narrative, but it took a little while.
Okay. So do you only represent your own clients in terms of book to screen, or do you also do that for some of the other literary agents at United Agents?
So as a sort of happy hangover, I do continue to represent one or two other authors of other agents for their screen rights, just because we have good relationships and I particularly like their work. But otherwise, it's just my own.
Okay, that's cool. Mm-hmm. I guess it's kind of nice that you are a sort of you do a lot of the process without having to bring in sort of more people to get things done.
Yeah, no, it's satisfying. It's nice to be able to sort of be more of a one-stop shop as an individual. But then obviously as an agency, we do have wider resources that I very much rely on as well.
Yes. Yeah. Of course. We don't have that many agents on the podcast who do sort of book to screen stuff. What does it entail? Like, how different is it from sort of publishing?
It's pretty different. It's a very, very different model. Totally different set of relationships, of course, largely with producers, and also with, I don't know if you've ever talked about or ever talked to scouts on the podcast. Do you know what I mean by a scout?
I've talked about scouts and I've spoken to agents who started as scouts, but I think it's one of those really unsung roles in publishing.
Yeah, it's a role that's sort of quite unusual and needs unpacking, but it is an unsung role. Scouts are brilliant and incredibly useful. And I was just mentioning them because there are scouts who specialise in book to screen. So there are a number of scouts who work both for international publishers and production companies, but some who just work with production companies. So there are some of those that I also have relationships with that I really lean on when I'm trying to get material out there to producers. But yes, it's a very different world really to the publishing world, where the sort of agreements and contracts are incredibly complicated up front, with very little upfront remuneration, but the sort of promise that if something actually does get made, that's a huge boon, and very exciting. But yes, it works differently.
Those deals are normally, there is some sort of like money up front, but then it's usually, am I right in thinking it's if we make this, when we make this, you'll make more money at the time.
Very much so. And of course, it completely, ideally, transforms the life of the book. So, it's just an exceptionally exciting thing for an author if your book is transferred to screen for lots of reasons, not just financial.
Mm-hmm. Is it something, because you've kind of worked in that space and continue to work in that space, when you're like reading query letters, is that something you think about when you're reading a manuscript? Is like, do you think about the adaptability of that for screen?
I think partially. It's not my sort of primary thought, but I think it's there, and it's exciting when you read something that you sort of organically think, yes, actually this has huge potential for screen too, because that's a really nice part of the picture if you can make it happen. I mean, much more often than not, and this is still quite exciting in and of itself, but much more often than not, something might get optioned but never be made. So I have a number of things under option at the moment, and probably, I don't know, I probably have a conversion rate of 1 in 10 or something, which I don't think is that unusual.
Yeah, that's about the people that I've spoken to around this. That's about what people say is like 1 in 10 optioned novels actually turn into a television or film or whatever.
Yes, exactly, which is just the way it goes. And equally, I think, producers have a number of things at any one time in development, with the expectation that a number of them will never actually see broadcast or ever be really, be made. And that's just the way it goes. It's so complex getting all the pieces together.
It's so competitive, and it's so much money to do a production like that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, there's much more at stake in various ways, I think.
For sure.
And just as I think what's quite interesting in terms of the life of a book, and when it is adapted, that's very interesting, is that when it's a book, the writer of the book is the principal creative party, right? But when it comes to adapting the work, the director and the actors suddenly become vastly more important, and there are so many more creative voices involved. And I think that sort of the fact that the text itself is not the only thing is really fascinating as well. Yeah,
for sure. And it's an entirely different skill from writing a novel, and writing a screenplay is adapting a novel into a screenplay.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I think lots of authors are kind of intrigued by the challenge of adapting their own work. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. But I think there's always, even if you do adapt it yourself, there's always nonetheless a moment where you have to relinquish control because it falls into the hands of so many other people who are going to bring their own context and interpretation to the work. It's just when you write your own book, you're almost entirely in control of the story, and that just changes so much when it's adapted.
Yeah, absolutely. Because writing a novel, there's usually 2 or 3 people involved. You'll have your editor, maybe your agent, but with obviously there's a lot more chefs in the kitchen when it comes to the screen adaptation.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'd love to get onto you a bit now and talk about your list. So just for everyone listening, what's the sort of range of authors and genres that you represent?
It's pretty broad and eclectic. I represent some literary fiction. I represent some, I suppose, what you might categorize as sort of upmarket commercial fiction. Too. I represent some cookery, some memoir, some journalism. I mean, journalists writing sort of narrative nonfiction. That probably covers it.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's pretty wide ranging. And then little sort of smatterings of slightly more sort of celebrity inflected things too.
So it might be easier to frame it as what you don't represent, it sounds like, is more kind of genre stuff.
Exactly.
Or anything YA or children's.
Exactly that. So I don't represent sci-fi, fantasy, I don't represent sort of ultra commercial fiction. And yes, I don't represent YA or children's, although I've recently been working on a novel that's kind of YA crossover, and it was quite interesting sharing that book with publishers because one or two felt it was YA, others generally didn't. And then seeing that book, how people reacted to that book in foreign markets, again, was really interesting because different markets have very different relationships to YA and what that means. So it was bought, I think, for a YA list in France, for example, but it's not being published as YA here. So there are always slight outliers on my list as well.
That's interesting. That must have been because what I've heard about, obviously crossover, new adult, that kind of space is very much kind of growing at the moment. But usually what I hear is that it's the YA authors and the agents that represent YA that are sort of pushing upwards into that, and less so adult authors sort of
pushing
moving down. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not something I sort of sought out or sought to represent as a category, but it's just a really extraordinarily well-written, moving story that happens to be narrated by a teenage protagonist, but with sort of quite grown-up themes. But I suppose this might be kind of cliche, but I'm just drawn to really what I perceive to be really exceptional writing, and I don't really mind otherwise, whether it's sort of going to then be categorized as literary or commercial, or for a younger reader or a more mature reader, if it happens to sort of affect me and I can see a path to selling it, quite importantly, then I'm always keen to work with people on that sort of, whatever it might be.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that sounds great. Obviously the focus is what is this thing in isolation without everything else? Like, what does this story give me?
Yes. And I just felt with this particular book, if it made me cry, I just thought if it's going to sort of get your gut like that, then I've got a really good chance there's a really good chance that other people will feel the same way. And there is all of that sort of cynical and more calculated thinking, of course, that goes on when you're reading work in terms of, what's the market for this? What's its potential value? Who could I see publishing it? But if you can kind of cut through all of that to, has this book just completely broken my heart or moved me very powerfully, then it's sort of irresistible and ought to be a no-brainer. It's never necessarily that straightforward, but if it's that affecting, I would hope that other people would feel the same way, and therefore it would find a way to being published without thinking too carefully about categories and register and, whose list and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. And I would say, as someone sort of outside of agenting looking in, I would imagine you as an agent must, first of all, have your finger on the pulse of what is working and stuff like that. And also you must read so much that if something really does affect you, then it must really stand out, I would imagine.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. And, I think it's the same for any reader. You might go through a patch where you're reading things and they're just not quite hitting home, and you might think to yourself, God, do I not even enjoy reading? Why is this experience just not capturing me anymore? And then you read something and think, oh, there it is. And this is your faith is sort of restored in your own capacity to connect with good books.
Yeah.
So even I think as a lay reader, you feel that sometimes. And then certainly professionally, you can be trying to read things and sort of struggling to really engage and stay with things and worrying that it's you. And sometimes it is you for one reason or another, but largely it's just because the thing isn't reaching you, and that's just a sort of chemical thing, or a sort of you just have to sort of hold on and trust that when it's the right thing, you'll know. And I think editors feel that way very much too.
No, I feel that acutely, because I used to be, when I was younger, I always used to sort of, if I wasn't enjoying a book, and this was probably the same with like a television show or a movie, I would just kind of soldier through it and just think, oh no, it probably gets better. But now I just don't have the time really. So it's more, if I'm not enjoying something, I'll think, okay, well, you know, whether it's me or the book, this partnership is not working. I'm just going to put this down and read something else.
Yeah, well, exactly. And quite often there's a confusing middle ground where something is sort of adequately readable and you're sort of passing the time and it's kind of a good enough experience, but it's not completely captivating. And actually, I think there are a lot of times where you might submit a novel to a number of publishers, and some of the feedback you might get, or I sometimes get, is, you know, I really enjoyed reading this, but I didn't quite feel passionately enough. That's a bit of a sort of repeated answer, but I get it in that I can see this is good, I enjoyed it, but I need to feel so much more for this to be able to want to live with it, edit it a number of times, see it through to publication over the course of a year or more. So it really needs to sort of punch beyond feeling sort of like a nice experience. It really has to feel extraordinary. Yeah. For me to want to take the risk of publishing it.
Yeah, exactly. No, and it's, the industry feels more risk averse than it's ever been. I think there's the same with a lot of industries around the world. So yeah, like you say, you really have to believe in it.
Exactly, because it's a long process and it's really risky and it's tough to make things work. And there's so much potential heartbreak in it because there are things you really believe in that don't always reach the readership they should. So you really have to love something to want to take those risks, I think.
So I think I'm interpreting this as we're largely talking about fiction. Is that also kind of how you try and approach non-fiction, or is there a sort of difference in the way that you look at it?
That's a good question. I think unless it's sort of, you know, very personally driven narrative non-fiction, there's probably a little bit more head and a little bit less heart in thinking about non-fiction. Yes, I suppose that's right. But perhaps the parallel is, and this is actually really a sort of a phrase I don't really want to use, but does this sort of tickle my mind? Does this kind of excite my mind in the way that fiction might sort of grab my heart, possibly, in some senses? Like, is this subject and the way that it's being approached exciting intellectually? That might be how I think about nonfiction a bit more. Or is this kind of innovating in one way or another? Is this provoking totally new thoughts in my own mind? Is this going to really sort of stimulate other people's minds, I suppose? But again, if it's more emotionally driven nonfiction, then I would return to looking for a more emotional response, I think.
Yes. I had one of your authors, Kate Young, on the podcast not long ago. And I know that you signed her originally with the Little Library Cookbook series, which are great.
Yes.
But she's now since published her debut, and she has fiction and non-fiction. Is was that something that you two had always like discussed? Is that something that you were kind of encouraging her to also do fiction?
No, no, it wasn't. But of course, the Little Library Cookbook series, by definition, are, you know, all about celebrating literature and food. So I know that she's an extraordinarily prolific reader and passionate about fiction, and so it kind of, well, actually, I was about to say it makes sense to me that she then wanted to write fiction, which doesn't necessarily hold. But no, it was a very pleasant surprise that she said she wanted to write fiction. And I don't know whether she talked about this with you, but the first novel that she wrote was not the novel we then went on to sell.
Yeah, she did.
Yeah. So she went through a really interesting process, I think, of trying to write something, I think, not wanting to speak for her, and you've obviously covered this already, but trying to write something I think she felt she ought to write, or that kind of paid tribute to the kind of books she enjoyed reading. And when that didn't work, she actually just scrapped it and said, I just want to write something that brings me pure joy. I want to write something that is just enormous fun. And that's what she did, and that's what worked, which was interesting when she let go of, I think, overthinking it. Although that said, she was incredibly smart about researching the rom-com genre and sort of calculating the sort of scaffolding of the book. But beyond that, she just went and had fun. And that was really a really joyful experience as her agent, because it was just, the book was pure fun and brilliantly well written. Just a total pleasure to share with people, because it made me smile and laugh and moved me also. And I was pretty certain other people would feel the same way.
Yeah, absolutely. And like your description of how she approached that, the second book, not the first one, which isn't the one that ended up being published, sounds very much, it's in line with how you are a kind of approach looking through queries and looking for new people to add to your list. Yeah.
In that it felt sort of very obvious, because it was just, I just immediately loved reading it. It's not always that straightforward, of course. And I've worked with many authors where there's enough there that you trust that it's worth developing the manuscript and working through a number of drafts to get to that feeling. It's not always doesn't always immediately strike you that it's sort of an obvious one. But in Kate's case, after having had, a kind of difficult time with the first one where it just didn't feel right, it was so wonderful that the second one just hit all the right notes. It was a very straightforward experience for me as an agent to sell it, which was very pleasing.
Yeah, amazing. On a wider scale, your list, fiction and non-fiction, is it about a 50-50 split, or do you lean more heavily in one direction?
It keeps sort of moving, because I would have said possibly a year or two ago that it felt more weighted towards non-fiction, but at the moment it feels as though fiction is coming back strong on my list, strangely. And that also possibly reflects where the market is, in that I think non-fiction is particularly difficult at the moment. So for now, I seem to have found myself working on more fiction than non-fiction, which surprises me, but it's just sort of organically happened.
Oh, interesting. I don't generally on the podcast much more sort of fiction minded. What's tricky about non-fiction at the moment?
It seems that, generally speaking, publishers have found in the last year or so, I think, that a lot of non-fiction just hasn't landed in the market. So a lot of books have underperformed, and there's quite a lot of puzzlement around that and concern. And therefore, there's a lot more caution around non-fiction, and I think a sense that to get a non-fiction proposal over the line, it's really got to be exceptionally strong and robust. And it just doesn't, it's interesting how things move. I came back from maternity leave in the middle of last year, and my sense was when I came back that there had been a real boom in non-fiction, and that publishers were buying non-fiction at very high prices. And perhaps then we've seen a fallout from that, in that people had paid a huge amount for books that then struggled to live up to those advances in the last year. And then there's a little bit of a sort of reverb from that now. That may be what's happened.
Oh, I see. I guess a lot of, with any kind of creative industry, it's all ebbs and flows though, isn't it? Something's out of fashion for a bit, it comes back in.
Exactly. Totally. It's all cyclical. Totally.
Yeah. Before we venture over to the desert island, I did want to ask one more thing. You've been doing this for a while now. Your list is around 60 people. I wanted to ask, as an agent, when your list grows, does it change the way that you consider queries from new authors? Like, is there more you have to think about with a bigger list?
I think that the way that you think, yes, the way that you consider the shape and size of your list changes. I think when you're starting out, you're very excited, I think, and chuffed to be representing people, and perhaps thinking slightly less, or at least I can only speak for myself. I was thinking slightly less about, well, look, how much time and energy am I going to need to put into this project to see it through? Mm-hmm. How likely is it that this is going to sell sort of meaningfully? I was excited to represent people who I thought were interesting and excellent and doing exciting things, which is still the case. But I do have to be more pragmatic now. Even if someone's doing something that I think is really quite interesting, I might have to say to myself, realistically, can I see this? Can I see myself selling this in a meaningful way? How much of my time and energy is going to be needed to make that happen? And even if things might sort of tickle my fancy, I might just have to say no in a way that I probably wouldn't have 5 or 8 years ago.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a different sort of pragmatism maybe.
I spoke to Megan Carroll recently, asked her a similar question, and she was saying, yeah, there's with the much bigger list, she was saying she's had queries that she adored, but she wanted to take them on, but she looked at her schedule and just knew that if she did take them on, it would be months and months and months before she would actually have time to meaningfully interact with that author and that novel, right. And it just wouldn't be fair to them.
Yes, that's also absolutely right. Exactly. That's a sort of perhaps a more relational way to think about it, which is like, Can I give this person what they need? That's true. Can I make this relationship meaningful enough for them? And can I give them what they're owed? Because the worst thing is for a writer to feel sidelined, overlooked, ignored by their agent. It's just miserable. Mm-hmm. It's not fair and it's very unproductive. So you would never want to be taking people on knowing there's a risk that you would let them down, of course.
Yeah. Do you think, just on from that, is there ever a point, presumably there is a point where you are just not really considering many queries when your list reaches a certain size where you say, like, I can take one person per X amount of time?
I'm not at that point. I'm always really interested to see when agents say, my list is full.
Yeah.
I'm not that guy at this point. Also because I would never want to miss anything exceptional. So, and I still feel as though I'm developing my list. It's still evolving. I think over the course of time, you start to sort of get a strong sense of which of your authors might sort of establish themselves as sort of consistent repeat authors, and which might sort of write at a different pace and sort of, resurface every few years with something special. And then there'll be others where you probably recognize actually there was one book there and we might not, foreseeably work together again. Mm-hmm. So unless and until I have a list that feels, really sort of that it's motoring on the level of repeat authors, people who are going to write a book a year, or that's I don't really have that kind of author, but authors who I know are going to keep writing and keep working across the whole list. I always feel as though there's space because people go quiet for a long time. Yeah. And so I haven't got 60 people producing work at any one time.
Yeah. That makes sense. Yeah, I hadn't thought about it in those terms, the kind of the different rate at which authors are doing things. And in that, a lot of it comes down to genre and stuff too. And you represent literary fiction authors who often, like you say, they'll write a book every 4 years or 5 years.
Yeah.
And equally, you represent cookbook authors who might do multiple books a year. So I guess it would take a long time to even see where the kind of average up and down on workflow for each author would be anyway.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And for example, at the start of this year, I sold 2 novels by a literary author of mine, the first of which won't be delivered till November 2025. So they're sort of busy and under contract. But, for the next year, there's not a huge amount that I'll be sort of involved with for them. So I people are sort of busy at different moments and go quiet at different moments. So anyway, as it stands at the moment, I'm not sort of closing my list.
No. Ready to expand, ready to grow, ready for more people to query you.
Yes.
And that brings us to the point in the episode where I ask you, Zoe, if you were stranded on a desert island with a single book, which book do you hope that it would be?
So, knowing this question was coming, the first book that came to mind, which I'm going to declare, I've been sort of thinking why, and I'm going to try and explain. But this was my instinctive answer, so I'm going to share it. This is a book by a French novelist called Marguerite Duras, called The Lover or L'Amant. And this is a book that I discovered as a student and loved very much and have continued to think about a lot over the years. And I feel slightly embarrassed by my choice because I think it's a fairly sort of pretentious studenty choice. But it's what I wanted to say, so I'm saying it. And I think I really, really love the French language and I'm not as proficient as I once was, but I think this novel I can still manage. So I feel as though it would sort of engage that part of my mind if I had it with me and I could continue to reread it. And I think a lot of its themes and its sort of stylistic elements are really sort of tie into things that I'm really interested in still. And I think I would still get a lot out of it, and it might remind me of being young as well, to keep reading it. Remind me of being 20.
I like that. And it would be the sort of bonus of probably refamiliarizing you with the French language, which maybe you'd then be inspired to pick up again.
Yeah, I mean, I can still speak enough to be able to read a novel. It's sort of deceptively simplistically written to my memory. So I feel like I could cope with it, I think. I haven't looked at it in the last couple of years, but it also just reminds me as well, those very beautifully published French books, very, very elegant and classic book jackets that are kind of off-white, kind of cream with either a blue or a red border, and sort of they're all very uniform. And when I was a student, I studied languages and I spent a year in Paris as an intern at a French publishing house. And I just, was fetishistically, very much in love with their books. And it reminds me of all of that atmosphere and that world as well.
I think it's a great choice.
Thanks.
And now that you've explained it, it doesn't come across as pretentious. I don't think it's more like a memory of your youth and a kind of like touching a book that really reached you.
Yeah, it did in many ways. I always loved her very much as a writer when I was younger. Next
up, I've got some questions about more on the specifics of querying and how you tackle that, as well as I'd love to ask about kind of where the idea of concept is king is in today's market, but that will all be in the extended episode available on Patreon. So
Absolutely.
hats off to anyone who does embark on that journey and actually finish it.
Exactly. Totally agree.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Zoe. That's got us to the end of the episode. Thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me and telling me all about your work at United Agents and everything you've been up to. It's been really interesting chatting with you.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been great.
And for anyone interested in querying Zoe or any of the team over at United Agents, head over to unitedagents.co.uk/submission-guidelines and you'll find all the information you need there. To support the podcast, like, follow and subscribe, join the Patreon for ad-free extended episodes and check out my other podcasts, The Chosen Ones and Other Tropes. Thanks again to Zoe and thanks to everyone listening. We will catch you in the next episode.